On October 14, 2016, the commander of the People's Liberation Army Air Force radar network stood inside a secure command center north of Nanjing, watching green blips traverse digital displays representing every aircraft moving within 400 kilometers of Chinese airspace. He had been briefed repeatedly on the capabilities of the JY-27A long-range surveillance radar now operational along the eastern coast, and he believed what the engineers had told him. This VHF active electronically scanned array system could detect targets with a radar cross-section as small as 0.01 square meters, meaning even American stealth aircraft would appear on Chinese screens as clearly as any fourth-generation fighter. The confidence was understandable. For years, the narrative within China's military establishment had been consistent and emphatic. Low-frequency radar systems could defeat stealth technology because the radar-absorbent coatings applied to aircraft like the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II were optimized for high-frequency X-band and S-band radars, not the longer wavelengths of VHF systems operating between 1 and 10 meters. Chinese defense contractors had spent billions developing passive detection networks like the DWL002, which did not emit signals, but instead tracked electromagnetic emissions from aircraft themselves, theoretically rendering traditional stealth profiles useless. State media had broadcast claims that China possessed the technological answer to American air superiority, that the era of invisible jets penetrating defended airspace was over, and that any attempt by the United States to conduct operations near Taiwan or the South China Sea would be met with comprehensive detection and lethal response. Senior officers within the PLA believed their integrated air defense system was not only robust but revolutionary. A networked architecture of ground-based radars, airborne early warning platforms, surface-to-air missile batteries, and fighter aircraft all linked through secure data fusion nodes that would create an impenetrable sensor web. Yet what none of them fully understood was that American planners had been preparing for exactly this scenario for more than 2 decades, and the aircraft now entering service across the Pacific had been designed from the beginning to exploit the precise weaknesses that confidence had blinded them to. The story of how stealth technology reached its current apex begins not with a single breakthrough, but with a recognition in the late 1970s that controlling what the enemy could see mattered more than how fast you could fly or how many missiles you could carry. Engineers at Lockheed's Skunk Works and Northrop Grumman's Advanced Programs Division understood that every radar system, regardless of frequency, functioned by transmitting electromagnetic energy and detecting reflections from objects in the environment. The key to defeating radar was not to absorb every signal but to reflect it in directions away from the receiver, to shape the aircraft so that incident radar waves scattered into the sky or the ground rather than bouncing back to the antenna that emitted them. This principle, called radar cross-section reduction, became the foundation of the F-117 Nighthawk, the B-2 Spirit, the F-22 Raptor, and eventually the F-35 Lightning II. The F-35 in particular represented a generational leap because it combined low observability with sensor fusion, electronic warfare capabilities, and network-enabled operations, transforming the aircraft from a simple strike platform into what pilots described as a flying intelligence node capable of seeing, understanding, and sharing information across an entire battle space in real time. The jet's external geometry featured aligned edges where every surface angle was carefully calculated to minimize reflections back toward threat radars. The radar-absorbent material coating its skin was not a single layer, but a composite structure designed to attenuate signals across multiple frequency bands, including the VHF spectrum that adversaries believed would expose it. Internal weapon bays and fuel tanks ensured that the aircraft presented no external stores or pylons that would increase its radar signature. The engine inlet was serpentine, hiding the compressor blades from direct view and reducing infrared emissions from the exhaust. Every antenna, every sensor aperture, every surface discontinuity was either eliminated, faired, or treated to preserve the jet's stealth profile. What emerged was an aircraft with a radar cross-section measured not in square meters but in fractions of a square meter, and in certain aspects, far smaller than even the most optimistic Chinese assessments assumed possible. Chinese engineers had indeed made progress in radar technology, but they had also made a critical error in assumptions about how stealth aircraft would be employed. The JY-27A radar system, which entered service around 2014, used VHF frequencies and active phased array technology to scan large volumes of airspace for low observable targets. Its detection range against conventional aircraft exceeded 500 kilometers, and its ability to process returns with low radar cross-sections was genuine. But detection is not the same as tracking, and tracking is not the same as targeting. VHF radars suffer from poor angular resolution due to their long wavelengths, meaning that while they might detect the presence of an object in a general area, they cannot provide the precise location data required to guide a missile to intercept. A VHF radar might indicate that something is within a 30-kilometer box at a certain altitude, but a surface-to-air missile system like the HQ-9 or the Russian-built S-400 requires target coordinates accurate to within meters, and those systems rely on higher-frequency fire control radars operating in X-band or Ku-band to achieve that precision. The F-35 was specifically shaped and coded to defeat those higher-frequency radars, which meant that even if a long-range VHF system detected an anomaly, the fire control radar attempting to lock onto the target would see nothing, or see a return so weak and intermittent that it could not maintain a continuous track long enough to launch a missile with any confidence of success. This was the gap in the integrated air defense system that American planners had identified and intended to exploit, and it was a gap that no amount of confidence or investment in low-frequency detection could close without a corresponding revolution in fire control radar technology that China had not yet achieved. The DWL002 passive detection system represented another layer in China's anti-stealth strategy, and it was based on an entirely different principle. Rather than emitting radar pulses and waiting for reflections, the DWL002 listened for electromagnetic emissions from the aircraft itself. Radio communications, radar transmissions, electronic warfare signals, or even unintentional emissions from onboard systems. Passive sensors had the advantage of being undetectable because they did not radiate, and they could theoretically track an aircraft by triangulating its position based on signals collected by multiple receiving stations spread across hundreds of kilometers. The DWL002 reportedly consisted of 3 stations with wideband apertures, capable of detecting fighter aircraft at ranges of 400 kilometers, and larger platforms like AWACS aircraft at 600 kilometers. Chinese engineers believed this system could expose stealth aircraft by tracking emissions that low observability could not hide. But this approach also had fundamental limitations, because it assumed that the aircraft would emit signals that could be intercepted. The F-35's communications architecture was designed around low probability of intercept and low probability of detection waveforms, meaning that its data links used frequency hopping, directional transmissions, and encrypted bursts that were extremely difficult to detect, let alone geolocate. The F-35's AN/APG-81 AESA radar could operate in passive mode, collecting electromagnetic emissions from adversary radars without transmitting anything that could be tracked. Its AN/ASQ-239 electronic warfare system could jam enemy radars, spoof missile seekers, and provide pilots with real-time threat warnings while maintaining electronic silence when necessary. In contested airspace, F-35 pilots routinely operated with radios and active radar emissions minimized, relying instead on sensor fusion to integrate data from passive infrared sensors, electronic support measures, and data link information shared from other platforms operating outside the threat envelope. This meant that a passive detection system waiting for emissions would often find nothing to detect, or would detect emissions so brief and obscure that they provided no actionable targeting data. The confidence within the PLA was not entirely unfounded, because China's radar developers had made legitimate strides in digital signal processing, phased array antenna design, and networked sensor integration. The JY-27V system unveiled in 2025 was an evolution of the JY-27A with a larger antenna, lower operating frequency, greater power aperture, and artificial intelligence algorithms designed to enhance target discrimination and reduce false alarms. Chinese state media claimed that the JY-27V could detect and track extremely stealthy targets and guide precision strikes against them, language that suggested a belief that the system had closed the fire control gap. But claims are not the same as operational validation, and operational validation requires testing against actual stealth aircraft in realistic combat conditions, something China had no opportunity to conduct. The United States, by contrast, had been refining its stealth tactics and electronic warfare techniques through decades of red flag exercises, combat operations over Serbia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and continuous upgrades to its sensor and countermeasure suites informed by real-world intelligence collection and adversary radar analysis. American F-35 pilots had flown against simulated threat environments designed to replicate Chinese and Russian integrated air defense systems, and they had demonstrated repeatedly that with proper mission planning, electronic attack support, and coordinated ingress tactics, stealth aircraft could penetrate defended airspace, strike high-value targets, and egress without ever being effectively engaged. The difference was not just in the aircraft but in the entire operational ecosystem. Suppression of enemy air defenses, stand-in jamming from EA-18G Growlers, long-range standoff weapons that could destroy radar nodes before the stealth jets even crossed the line, and a level of aircrew training and tactical sophistication that adversaries could see from intercepts and intelligence reports but could not replicate. The operational reality of stealth versus detection networks came into focus during exercises and near-peer encounters over the Western Pacific in the years following the F-35's introduction into frontline service. In 2018, U.S. Air Force F-35, as deployed to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, began conducting regular patrols near the edge of Chinese airspace, often operating in areas where PLA radars were known to be active. Chinese radar operators reported intermittent contacts that appeared and disappeared, returns that matched no known flight profiles, and electronic signatures that suggested the presence of advanced aircraft but provided no consistent track data. On several occasions, Chinese J-16 fighters equipped with advanced electronic warfare pods were scrambled to intercept suspected F-35 incursions. But despite having access to data from both ground-based radars and airborne early warning aircraft, the interceptors never achieved a radar lock strong enough to simulate a missile engagement. Pilots returning to base reported frustration at chasing contacts that vanished as soon as they attempted to transition from search radar to fire control mode, a phenomenon consistent with an aircraft designed to minimize its signature precisely in the radar frequencies used for terminal guidance. Declassified U.S. Intelligence assessments from this period noted that Chinese air defense networks demonstrated an ability to detect the general presence of stealth aircraft under certain conditions, particularly when the aircraft were flying in configurations with external stores or when they were operating at angles where their radar cross-section was less optimized, but that these detections rarely translated into actionable targeting data. The assessment concluded that while Chinese radar technology had advanced, it had not fundamentally overcome the physics of low observability, and that American stealth aircraft retained a decisive advantage in penetrating contested airspace as long as they were employed with disciplined tactics and supported by the broader joint force. The technical specifications of the F-35 stealth features reveal why confidence in radar detection systems alone was misplaced. The aircraft's aligned edges ensure that radar reflections are concentrated into narrow lobes directed away from the emitting radar rather than scattered omnidirectionally. The jet's composite materials and radar-absorbent coatings are multi-layered structures that attenuate incident electromagnetic energy through a combination of absorption, destructive interference, and impedance matching, with effectiveness that spans from VHF through X-band frequencies. The F-35's AN/APG-81 AESA radar has more than 1,200 transmit-receive modules and can operate in dozens of modes including synthetic aperture radar mapping, ground-moving target indication, air-to-air search and track, electronic warfare support, and electronic attack. All while maintaining a low probability of intercept because each module transmits at low power, and the beam can be rapidly steered and modulated to avoid conventional radar warning receivers. The distributed aperture system consists of 6 infrared cameras positioned around the aircraft to provide spherical situational awareness, missile launch detection, and even the ability for pilots to see through the jet via the helmet-mounted display, capabilities that provide tactical advantages entirely separate from radar stealth, but that multiply the aircraft's survivability. The electro-optical targeting system is embedded in the fuselage rather than mounted externally, preserving stealth while providing long-range infrared search and track, laser designation, and targeting support. The electronic warfare suite can detect, identify, and geolocate threat emitters, then either avoid them, jam them, or provide targeting data to other platforms or weapons to destroy them, creating a layered defense that does not rely solely on stealth, but uses stealth as the foundation for a broader suite of survival mechanisms. Together, these systems create an aircraft that is not merely hard to see, but that actively manages the electromagnetic and infrared battlespace to ensure that adversaries are not only blind, but that they remain unaware of how blind they are until ordnance is already in flight. The rivalry between the F-35 and China's own fifth-generation fighter, the J-20, added another dimension to the stealth versus detection debate. The J-20 entered service with the PLA Air Force in 2017 and was positioned as China's answer to American air superiority, a long-range air dominance fighter designed to operate within China's anti-access area denial strategy. The J-20 was larger than the F-35, optimized for speed and range rather than multi-role versatility, and equipped with indigenous WS-10C engines that eventually provided limited supercruise capability. Chinese military analysts claim that the J-20's stealth characteristics were comparable to those of American fifth-generation fighters, and that its integration with PLA sensor networks would allow it to leverage long-range missiles to engage adversaries before they could close to visual range. But the J-20 had never been tested in combat. Its pilots had no experience operating in contested airspace against peer adversaries, and its sensor fusion capabilities, while advanced by Chinese standards, were assessed by Western intelligence to lag significantly behind the F-35's integrated avionics architecture. The F-35's sensor fusion was not simply a collection of individual systems, but a unified picture generated by artificial intelligence algorithms that process data from all onboard sensors, external data links, and threat libraries to present pilots with a coherent, prioritized understanding of the battle space. This fusion allowed a single F-35 to detect, identify, and track dozens of targets simultaneously, while sharing that data with other aircraft, surface ships, ground units, and command centers, creating a networked force where the sum of situational awareness far exceeded what any individual platform could achieve. The J-20, by contrast, appeared to rely on more traditional sensor integration where radar, infrared, and electronic warfare data were presented separately, requiring pilots to manually correlate information and make decisions with less automated support. In a hypothetical engagement, this difference in sensor fusion maturity could mean the difference between detecting a threat 10 seconds earlier or 10 seconds later, and in air combat, 10 seconds is the difference between life and death. Chinese confidence in their air defense network was also undermined by structural vulnerabilities in their command, control, communications, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance architecture. The DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles that China deployed to threaten U.S. Navy carrier strike groups required over-the-horizon targeting data to strike moving ships thousands of kilometers away, data that had to come from a network of satellites, maritime patrol aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, and surface radars. The same logic applied to engaging stealth aircraft. Detection from a long-range VHF radar was useless without a continuous high-resolution track that could be handed off to a fire control system, and maintaining that track required uninterrupted data flow across multiple sensor nodes. But networks are fragile, and the more complex a network becomes, the more points of failure it contains. The United States had invested heavily in cyber warfare capabilities, electronic attack platforms, and anti-radiation missiles specifically designed to disrupt and destroy enemy sensor networks. If a key early warning radar was jammed or destroyed, if a data link node was compromised by cyber intrusion, if a satellite was blinded or its data feed was spoofed, then the entire kill chain from detection to engagement collapsed. American doctrine emphasized attacking the network rather than individual systems, and the F-35 played a central role in that strategy by serving not just as a strike platform, but as a sensor and electronic warfare node that could locate radars, feed their positions to standoff weapons, and then penetrate the resulting gaps in coverage before defenses could reconstitute. This approach meant that even if Chinese radars could theoretically detect an F-35 under ideal conditions, those ideal conditions would never exist in actual conflict, because the Americans would ensure that the network was degraded, confused, and under constant attack from the moment hostilities began. The psychological impact of technological surprise cannot be understated, and the history of warfare is littered with examples of confident forces suddenly confronted with capabilities they did not anticipate and could not counter. During the opening night of Operation Desert Storm in 1991, Iraqi air defense operators watched as precision-guided munitions destroyed command bunkers and communication nodes without warning. Attacks delivered by F-117 stealth fighters that never appeared on their radar screens. The Iraqis had been assured by Soviet advisors that their integrated air defense system, built around SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, and Roland missile batteries networked with early warning and fire control radars, was among the most formidable in the world outside the USSR itself. Yet within hours, the system was crippled, not because every radar was destroyed, but because key nodes were eliminated, command links were severed, and operators were left isolated and blind, firing missiles at ghosts while real threats struck with impunity. The lesson was clear. An adversary who controls what you see controls how you react, and an adversary who can appear and disappear at will has already won the battle for information dominance. Chinese planners studied Desert Storm intensively, and the PLA's investment in counter-stealth radar technology was a direct response to that traumatic demonstration of American air power. But they made the same error that the Iraqis had made, the same error that Soviet air defense commanders made when they insisted that nothing could outrun their missiles, and then watched SR-71 Blackbirds fly untouched above 85,000 feet. They assumed that technology alone would equalize the battlefield, that sensors and missiles could substitute for operational experience, tactical innovation, and the integrated application of force across all domains. The Americans understood that stealth was not a standalone capability, but a component of a broader strategy that included electronic warfare, cyber operations, precision strike, rapid maneuver, and the ability to sustain operations under conditions of uncertainty and chaos. The Chinese built impressive individual systems but had never tested them under the stress of actual combat, and the gap between confidence and reality would only be revealed when it was too late to adapt. If you appreciate discovering how intelligence, technology, and strategy intersect to determine the outcome of modern conflict, consider subscribing for future investigations into the classified breakthroughs that redefine warfare. By 2020, the pattern was unmistakable. Every time Chinese radar operators reported possible F-35 contacts, the tracks were ambiguous, fleeting, and insufficient for engagement. Every simulation conducted by PLA Air Force planners exploring scenarios where American stealth aircraft penetrated Chinese airspace revealed the same conclusion. Detection was possible, but interception was not guaranteed, and in many cases not achievable at all. Reports from joint exercises with the Russian military, which faced similar challenges in Syria when Israeli F-35s conducted strikes against Iranian-linked targets, confirmed that even advanced Russian-built radar systems like the S-400 had difficulty maintaining continuous track on low observable aircraft maneuvering at medium to high altitudes. Russian radar operators described seeing intermittent returns that appeared briefly during certain aircraft maneuvers, particularly when the jets were banking or accelerating and presenting larger aspect angles, but these returns disappeared as soon as the aircraft returned to level flight or changed course. The S-400's engagement radar, which operated in X-band for terminal homing, simply could not maintain the lock required to guide a missile to intercept. Russian military analysts privately acknowledged that stealth remained a formidable challenge, and that while detection technology had improved, the kill chain from detection to destruction had not been solved. The Chinese, despite their public statements of confidence, were receiving the same feedback from their own systems, and internal PLA assessments acknowledged that while the JY-27A and similar radars provided early warning value, they did not provide fire control quality data, and without that data, missiles could not engage. The operational implications were profound because control of the air is the foundation of modern joint operations. Without air superiority, ground forces are vulnerable to precision strikes, naval vessels cannot maneuver freely, and logistics networks become targets rather than enablers. The F-35's ability to penetrate contested airspace meant that it could strike air defense nodes, command centers, and critical infrastructure deep inside enemy territory before those assets could be used to threaten American or Allied forces. During the 2020s, U.S. Air Force and Allied F-35s conducted a series of exercises designed to test their ability to operate in simulated high-threat environments modeled on Chinese and Russian air defense networks. These exercises included Red Flag in Nevada, Pacific Iron in Guam, and multinational drills with Japanese, South Korean, and Australian forces across the Indo-Pacific region. In every case, F-35 formations demonstrated the ability to penetrate layered defenses, deliver simulated weapons on target, and egress without being effectively engaged by opposing forces. Debriefs from aggressor pilots and radar operators tasked with simulating Chinese capabilities consistently reported that they struggled to detect the F-35s until it was too late, and that even when they achieved brief radar contact, they could not maintain a track long enough to simulate a missile shot. The most revealing feedback came from pilots flying advanced fourth-generation fighters, equipped with modern radars and electronic warfare systems, who described the experience of trying to intercept an F-35 as disorienting and futile, because they could see that something was out there based on situational awareness cues, but their own sensors provided no actionable data. And by the time they maneuvered into a position where detection might be possible, the F-35 had already moved. Already struck and was already leaving the area. The F-35's electronic warfare capabilities magnified its stealth advantage by actively manipulating the electromagnetic environment to degrade adversary sensors. The AN/ASQ-239 Barracuda electronic warfare system was one of the most sophisticated ever installed on a tactical aircraft, capable of detecting and geolocating threat emitters across a wide frequency range, then selectively jamming those emitters with techniques tailored to each specific radar or communication system. Unlike legacy jamming pods that broadcast noise across broad frequency bands and could be easily detected and countered, the Barracuda used digital radio frequency memory to replicate and manipulate threat waveforms, creating false targets, range gate pull-off, velocity gate pull-off, and other deceptive techniques that caused enemy radars to lose track or track phantom returns instead of the actual aircraft. In some modes, the system could inject false data into adversary data links, corrupting the information shared between radars, command posts, and missile batteries, so that even if one sensor had an accurate track, the network system as a whole was fed contradictory and misleading information. This capability meant that the F-35 was not passively evading detection, but actively managing what the enemy could see, shaping the electromagnetic battlespace to its advantage, and ensuring that adversaries were not merely blind but confused, second-guessing their own data and unable to distinguish real threats from ghosts. Chinese radar operators began reporting exactly this phenomenon during exercises and operational patrols. Returns that appeared and disappeared unpredictably, contacts that seemed to jump discontinuously in space, and system alerts indicating jamming or deception that could not be resolved by changing frequencies or adjusting radar parameters. The conclusion drawn by some PLA electronic warfare specialists was that American aircraft were not just stealthy, but were employing cognitive electronic warfare techniques designed to exploit the decision-making processes of radar operators and command staff, inducing paralysis and hesitation at the critical moments when action was required. The rivalry between stealth aircraft and anti-stealth radar had become a technological arms race with no clear endpoint, but the advantage remained decisively with the aircraft for a fundamental reason. It is far easier to design a platform that minimizes its radar signature than to design a radar system that can reliably detect and track such a platform under all conditions and provide fire control data sufficient for engagement. Stealth is a matter of geometry, materials, and emissions control, all of which are within the control of the aircraft designer. Radar detection is a matter of overcoming physics, of transmitting enough energy to generate a detectable return from an object specifically designed not to return that energy, and doing so continuously over time and across a volume of airspace large enough to be operationally meaningful. Even if a radar could detect a stealth aircraft once, it had to detect it again a second later and a third second later, and maintain that track through maneuvers, electronic countermeasures, and the clutter of other objects in the environment. The challenge was exponentially harder when the stealth aircraft was supported by jamming, decoys, and standoff weapons that could destroy the radar before it ever had a chance to guide a missile. Chinese engineers understood this asymmetry, and it was why their most recent radar developments focused not just on better detection but on network sensor fusion that could combine data from multiple radars operating at different frequencies and locations to create a composite track that was more robust than any single sensor could provide. But networks require data links, and data links can be jammed, spoofed, or destroyed. Networks require centralized processing, and processing centers can be targeted. Networks require time to fuse data, and in air combat, time measured in seconds determines who shoots first. The Americans had designed their stealth aircraft not in isolation, but as part of a broader system of systems, where every element was optimized to survive and thrive in exactly the kind of networked, sensor-rich environment that adversaries were trying to create. And that systemic advantage could not be overcome by incremental improvements in radar technology alone. The operational confidence that Chinese military planners expressed publicly began to erode privately as more data accumulated from exercises, simulations, and intelligence collection on American stealth operations. Internal PLA Air Force reports from the early 2020s acknowledged that while significant progress had been made in early warning and situational awareness, the ability to actually intercept and destroy low observable aircraft remained uncertain, and that uncertainty posed a strategic problem for any conflict scenario involving Taiwan or the South China Sea. If the PLA could not guarantee air superiority over its own claimed territory, then it could not guarantee the success of amphibious operations, could not protect its surface fleet from air attack, and could not prevent American forces from striking targets deep inside mainland China. The realization that radar advancements alone were insufficient led to a broader reassessment of Chinese air defense strategy, with greater emphasis on dispersed, mobile systems that could relocate rapidly to avoid counterattack, on hardened and redundant command networks that could survive initial strikes, and on the development of longer-range air-to-air missiles that could engage targets at distances where visual identification was impossible, and where mid-course guidance from remote sensors might compensate for limitations in onboard radar. The PL-15 and PL-21 missiles represented this shift, with reported ranges exceeding 200 kilometers and data link capability that allowed them to be guided by external platforms until their own terminal seekers activated in the final phase of flight. But long-range missiles were only effective if the launching aircraft could get close enough to fire them without being detected first, and if the missile seeker could lock onto a target at the end of its flight, both conditions that were far from guaranteed against an adversary with superior stealth, superior situational awareness, and superior electronic warfare capability. The Americans, for their part, were not complacent. They understood that adversaries would continue to innovate, and that maintaining the stealth advantage required continuous investment in new materials, new shaping techniques, new electronic warfare algorithms, and new tactics. The Next Generation Air Dominance Program and the F-35's Block 4 modernization roadmap reflected this understanding, incorporating upgraded processors, new sensors, improved jamming techniques, and tighter integration with unmanned systems that could act as forward scouts, decoys, or strike platforms controlled by F-35 pilots from standoff distances. The concept of manned-unmanned teaming meant that an F-35 could send unmanned aircraft into the highest threat areas to provoke air defenses into revealing themselves, then either jam those defenses, strike them with anti-radiation missiles, or simply avoid them while prosecuting other targets, creating a level of operational complexity that no air defense network could fully counter. This approach acknowledged that stealth was not absolute, that there would always be scenarios where detection was possible, but that by layering stealth with deception, jamming, maneuver, and overwhelming the adversary's decision-making capacity, the overall effect would still be dominance of the battle space. The Chinese watched these developments closely and understood the implications. Even if they solved the detection problem, the Americans would shift the contest to another dimension, whether electronic warfare, cyber operations, speed, or network lethality. The arms race would never end, but the side with greater operational experience, greater resource depth, and greater integration across domains would always have the advantage. And in 2025, that side was still unquestionably the United States. The final verdict on China's anti-stealth radar confidence came not from a single engagement, but from the accumulated weight of evidence across years of simulations, exercises, intercepts, and intelligence assessments. Chinese radar operators had indeed detected American stealth aircraft on occasion, brief returns under specific geometric conditions when the aircraft were maneuvering, or when they were operating with external stores that compromised their signature. But those detections had never led to successful simulated intercepts, never resulted in fire control locks that would have allowed a missile to guide to impact, and never demonstrated that China possessed the capability to deny American stealth aircraft access to contested airspace. The gap between detecting something and being able to do something about it remained unbridged, And every attempt to close that gap through better radars, better missiles, or better networking revealed new challenges, new vulnerabilities, and new dimensions of American technological superiority. PLA commanders privately acknowledged that in any conflict involving the Taiwan Strait or the First Island Chain, American F-35s would be able to strike high-value targets, suppress air defenses, and support joint operations with a level of impunity that Chinese forces could disrupt but not prevent. The confidence that had characterized Chinese military rhetoric in the 2010s gave way to a more sober recognition that while significant progress had been made, parity with the United States in air dominance remained distant, and that any conflict would be extraordinarily costly even if certain tactical objectives could be achieved. The stealth advantage, far from being neutralized by radar innovation, remained one of the most decisive asymmetries in modern warfare, a technological edge that provided not just tactical benefits but strategic deterrence, because adversaries understood that they could not see, could not track, and could not kill what they could not find. The broader lesson extended beyond the specific case of the F-35 and Chinese radar networks, because the pattern repeated across other domains where confidence met reality and reality won. Submarines that adversaries believed were silent were tracked continuously by acoustic networks they did not know existed. Cyber networks that adversaries believed were secure were penetrated by intrusion tools they could not detect. Missile defenses that adversaries believed were impenetrable were bypassed by decoys, saturation, and hypersonic glide vehicles that exploited gaps in coverage. In every case, the mistake was the same, assuming that technology alone conferred advantage without accounting for the operational context, the adversary's countermeasures, and the integration of multiple capabilities into a coherent strategy. The United States had spent decades and trillions of dollars building not just individual systems, but an entire architecture of dominance that spanned space, cyber, air, sea, and land, where every element supported every other element, where information flowed seamlessly, and where decision-making was pushed to the edge so that tactical units could act with strategic awareness. China had built impressive systems, but it had not built that architecture, and without it, individual systems remained isolated and vulnerable no matter how advanced their technical specifications appeared on paper. The confidence that Chinese military planners expressed publicly was always tempered privately by the knowledge that in a real conflict, the Americans would not fight the way Chinese planners expected, would not allow their opponents to dictate the terms of engagement, and would exploit every advantage in speed, surprise, deception, and overwhelming force to paralyze and destroy before adversaries could respond. The F-35 was not the entirety of that strategy, but it was the tip of the spear, the platform that could penetrate deep, see everything, share everything, and strike with precision before defenses even knew they were under attack. Join us here at Classified Warfare as we continue to uncover the operations, technologies, and intelligence breakthroughs that kept the world on the brink and determine which nations saw first, struck first, and survived to dictate the terms of peace.